This bear cub thought the dog was his dad and refused to leave his side. The first pale light of dawn crept through the frost-kissed windows of Henry Miller's log cabin. At 73, the retired veterinarian still rose with the sun, a habit formed over decades of caring for animals in need. His arthritic fingers fumbled with a coffee pot as he prepared his morning brew, the rich aroma filling the small kitchen. Outside, the thermometer read 28 degrees, cold even for early December in Snowpine Creek, Washington. "Bailey," Henry called softly, his voice gravelly from sleep, "time for our walk, old girl." The aging golden retriever lifted her head from her plush bed near the wood stove. Her muzzle had long since turned white and cataracts clouded her once bright eyes, but at the mention of their morning ritual, her tail thumped against the floor with enthusiasm. She stretched, her joints creaking almost as much as Henry's, then padded over to where her leash hung by the door. Henry smiled, running a hand through his silver hair. "Some things never change, do they?" Bailey woofed softly in agreement, nosing at Henry's palm as he clipped on her leash. Their morning walks had been a constant for 11 years, ever since Henry had retired from his veterinary practice in Seattle and moved to this quiet cabin on the edge of the Cascade Range. The walks had grown shorter as they both aged, but neither was willing to give them up entirely. They stepped outside into the crisp morning air. Henry's breath formed clouds in front of his face as he carefully navigated the 3 wooden steps from his porch, Bailey patiently waiting beside him. The forest that bordered his property was dusted with fresh snow from the previous night, the pine trees standing like sentinels against the lightning sky. "Not too far today," Henry told Bailey as they set off along their usual path that skirted the edge of the dense woods. "My knees are feeling last night's storm." Bailey seemed content with the slower pace, stopping frequently to sniff at interesting spots beneath the snow. Their route took them past neighbor Carl Jameson's property, where smoke already rose from the chimney, and then toward the creek that gave the town its name. The tranquility of their morning was shattered when Bailey suddenly stiffened, her ears perking forward. Henry recognized the posture. She'd caught a scent of something unusual. "What is it, girl?" he asked, but Bailey was already barking, a sharp, urgent sound that echoed through the trees. Before Henry could tighten his grip on the leash, Bailey lunged forward with surprising strength, yanking it from his grasp. She bounded into the forest, disappearing among the trees. "Bailey!" Henry called, alarmed. In all their years together, she had never broken away like this. "Bailey, come back." Henry followed as quickly as his old legs would allow, pushing through low-hanging branches and wincing as snow slipped down his collar. He called Bailey's name repeatedly, following the sound of her continued barking deeper into the woods than they'd ventured in years. When he finally caught up to her, Bailey was circling a snow-covered pine bush, sniffing frantically and whining. As Henry approached, breathing hard from the exertion, he heard a faint sound, a pitiful mewing cry that seemed to come from beneath the bush. "Move aside, girl," Henry said gently, kneeling in the snow despite the protest from his joints. Bailey reluctantly backed up a few steps but continued to whine anxiously. Carefully, Henry parted the snow-laden branches and peered inside. What he saw made his heart catch in his throat. A tiny black bear cub, no more than a few days old, lay trembling on the frozen ground. Its eyes were still closed, its fur wet and matted against its small body. There was no sign of a mother bear anywhere. "Oh, little one," Henry murmured, immediately assessing the situation with his veterinarian's eye. The cub was newborn, too young to survive on its own, and clearly abandoned or orphaned. The mother must have given birth unusually early, perhaps disturbed from hibernation, And something had happened to her afterward. Henry knew the cub would die quickly in the cold without intervention, yet taking in a wild bear, even a newborn one, was fraught with complications. His mind raced through Washington state wildlife regulations, the dangers, the ethical considerations, while the tiny creature continued to whimper pitifully. Bailey nudged Henry's arm and looked up at him with knowing eyes, as if to say, "We can't leave it here." "You're right, old girl," Henry sighed, making his decision. "We can't just let it die." With gentle hands that had delivered countless animal babies over his career, Henry scooped up the cub. It was so small it fit easily in his palms, weighing hardly more than a puppy. He tucked it inside his coat for warmth and turned toward home. "Come on, Bailey, we've got work to do." Back at the cabin, Henry worked methodically, drawing on decades of veterinary experience. He cleaned the cub with warm water, carefully drying its dense black fur with soft towels. He prepared a formula that would approximate bear's milk as closely as possible, using supplies he still kept on hand for wildlife emergencies. The tiny cub suckled weakly at first, but soon grew stronger, gulping down the warm mixture. Henry fashioned a makeshift nest from a box lined with straw and old blankets, placing it near the wood stove where the temperature was constant and warm. Bailey hovered nearby the entire time, watching with intense focus, occasionally sniffing at the cub as if checking its progress. "You found him, so I guess you feel responsible," Henry told Bailey as he finished feeding the cub for the third time that day. "What should we call him, huh?" The cub, now fed and warm, was sleeping peacefully in its nest. Despite its small size, it had oversized paws that hinted at the large bear it would eventually become. "Those paws are big as a moose's," Henry chuckled. "That's it, we'll call him Moose." Night fell over Snowpine Creek, bringing with it a fresh snowfall that blanketed the world in silence. Henry made a bed for himself on the couch nearby, knowing the cub would need frequent feedings throughout the night. Bailey, however, surprised him by abandoning her usual sleeping spot. Instead, she curled up right beside the box containing the bear cub, resting her head on the edge where she could see Moose clearly. "Well, I'll be," Henry murmured, watching as Bailey settled in for the night, already taking on the role of guardian. "Looks like he's got himself a mother after all." Over the next few days, Henry fell into a routine of caring for the orphan cub. He called his old colleague, Dr. Sarah Jenkins, a wildlife veterinarian in Seattle, who advised him on proper nutrition and care. She also warned him about the legal implications. "You know you can't keep a wild bear permanently, Henry," she reminded him during one of their calls. "The Department of Wildlife will need to be notified." "I know, Sarah," Henry replied, watching as Bailey lay beside Moose's box, the cub now strong enough to crawl around inside it. "But he's too young for a wildlife center right now. Give me a few weeks to get him stronger, then we'll talk about next steps." Sarah sighed, knowing Henry's stubborn streak well. "Just be careful. Document everything: weight, feeding, behavior. I'll help however I can." Henry thanked her and hung up, knowing she was right but not quite ready to make that call. Every day that passed, he grew more attached to the little cub, and Bailey was utterly devoted to him. On the 7th day, as Henry was preparing Moose's morning formula, he heard Bailey bark excitedly from the living room. He hurried in to find Moose with his eyes open for the first time, tiny black orbs blinking in the morning light. The cub's gaze landed on Bailey, who lay protectively beside the box, and something remarkable happened. Moose made a small huffing sound and tried to crawl toward Bailey, as if drawn to her by some invisible force. Henry watched transfixed as Bailey gently nuzzled the cub, who responded by pressing against her golden fur. In that moment, Henry knew something extraordinary was taking place. Moose had imprinted on Bailey as his mother. The weeks passed and Moose grew rapidly under their care. By January, he had graduated from his box to a larger pen Henry constructed in the corner of the living room. His personality emerged, playful, curious, and utterly devoted to Bailey. He followed her everywhere she would go, mimicking her movements and behaviors in a way that often left Henry chuckling in disbelief. When Bailey chewed on her rubber bone, Moose would grab one too, gnawing awkwardly with his developing teeth. When she barked at squirrels through the window, Moose would stand on his hind legs beside her, making his own soft huffing sounds. At night, he would still curl up against Bailey's warm belly, sometimes draping a growing paw over her back as they slept. Henry knew he couldn't keep this arrangement secret forever. Snowpine Creek was a small town of just over 500 people, and word traveled fast. He decided to be proactive, reaching out first to his closest neighbor and friend, Margaret Wilson, a retired elementary school teacher who had always had a soft spot for animals. When Margaret visited and saw Moose trailing after Bailey like an oversized black shadow, she laughed until tears streamed down her face. "Oh, Henry," she wheezed, "only you would end up with a bear who thinks he's a golden retriever." "He needed help, Maggie," Henry said defensively. "What was I supposed to do?" Margaret's expression softened. "You did the right thing, but what's your plan?" "He's getting bigger every day." Henry sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I've been talking to Sarah Jenkins in Seattle. She's helping me apply for a special permit, a semi-wild conservation designation. It's rarely granted, but with my background and connections, we might have a chance." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "The town will support you, Henry, you know that. But you might want to start preparing people just in case." And so, carefully, Henry began introducing the idea of Moose to the townspeople of Snowpine Creek. He started with Carl Jameson, who ran the local hardware store and was chairman of the town council. Carl was skeptical at first, but melted when he saw how gentle Moose was with Bailey, even as the cub grew to match the dog in size. "Darndest thing I ever saw," Carl admitted, watching Moose delicately take a dog treat from Henry's hand like something out of a storybook. By late February, most of Snowpine Creek knew about Moose, and to Henry's relief, the reaction was largely positive. The town had always prided itself on its connection to the surrounding wilderness, and many residents saw Moose as a symbol of that relationship, wild yet connected to their community through Henry and Bailey. Meanwhile, Henry worked tirelessly to create an environment that would serve Moose's needs as he grew. He converted his old storage shed into a larger shelter, reinforcing the walls and adding insulation. He expanded the fenced area of his yard, creating a space where Moose could explore, climb, and dig. Dr. Jenkins visited twice, bringing vaccines and performing health checks on Moose. She was impressed by his development and his unusual bond with Bailey. "I've never seen anything quite like it," she admitted, watching as Moose leaned against Bailey while she examined him. "He's perfectly healthy physically, but behaviorally he's somewhere between a bear and a dog. It's fascinating." "Will that help with the permit application?" Henry asked hopefully. Sarah hesitated. "It might. The committee will consider his ability to be rehabilitated and released into the wild. Given his imprinting on Bailey and his comfort around humans, that's unlikely to be successful. Sometimes that works in favor of a permanent care arrangement." As winter began to yield to spring, Moose continued to grow. His once fuzzy black coat now gleamed with health, and he stood 3 times Bailey's size, though he still deferred to her in all things. He had learned to be gentle with his enormous strength, especially around Bailey, whose aging body grew more fragile with each passing month. The permit application process dragged on, with forms and inspections and more forms. Henry complied with every requirement, building what amounted to a small bear sanctuary in his backyard, complete with climbing structures, a digging pit, and even a small pond where Moose could learn to fish, a natural bear behavior that Henry encouraged despite Moose's preference for dog kibble. In early April, with the permit still pending but looking promising, Henry decided it was time for a special outing. The snow had mostly melted, wildflowers were beginning to dot the forest floor, and the air carried the sweet promise of spring. He packed a small lunch, Bailey's medications, and a jar of honey for Moose, planning to take them camping at the edge of the forest on his property. A family day out, he told them as Bailey pranced excitedly by the door and Moose watched curiously. "Time for you to practice some more bear skills, big guy." They set off in the warm morning sun, Henry leading the way with Bailey at his side and Moose following faithfully behind. They hiked slowly to accommodate both Henry's and Bailey's aging bodies, but the pace suited them all fine. They reached a small clearing about half a mile from the cabin where a flat outcropping of rock offered a perfect spot to rest and enjoy the view of the valley below. Henry spread out a blanket while Bailey sniffed around the perimeter and Moose, increasingly curious about his surroundings, began investigating a nearby berry bush. Though the berries wouldn't ripen until summer, Henry encouraged Moose to sniff and explore, pointing out different plants and trees that would eventually provide food. "See those scratches on that tree trunk?" Henry pointed to a tall pine with claw marks running up its bark. "That's from another bear. They climb trees for safety and to find food." Moose approached the tree cautiously, sniffing at the marks before experimentally placing his own claws against the bark. With a little encouragement from Henry, he began to climb, awkwardly at first but with increasing confidence, until he was several feet off the ground. "Look at that, Bailey," Henry said proudly as the old dog watched from beneath the tree, her tail wagging slowly. "Are boys learning to be a bear after all?" The day passed pleasantly as they explored the forest edge. Henry showed Moose how to turn over logs to find insects, how to identify different animal tracks, and how to wade in the shallow edge of a small stream. Bailey supervised it all with maternal vigilance, never straying far from Moose despite her obvious fatigue. As afternoon began to fade toward evening, Henry decided it was time to head back. He packed up their supplies while Bailey rested under a pine tree, Moose sitting protectively beside her. The scene warmed Henry's heart, his unusual family, bound together by circumstance and love, enjoying a perfect spring day. He took one last photo with the old film camera he still preferred over digital, capturing Bailey and Moose in the golden late afternoon light. Then he slung his backpack over his shoulder and called to them, "Time to head home, you two." That's when it happened. As Henry stepped onto the narrow path that would lead them back toward the cabin, his foot caught on a wet stone, slick with moss and spring runoff. He felt himself falling, arms flailing as he tried to catch his balance. His body twisted awkwardly, and he landed hard on his side, pain shooting through his hip and up into his chest. The pain was intense but not unfamiliar. Henry recognized the tightening in his chest immediately, his heart condition exacerbated by the fall and the stress. His vision swam, darkness creeping in at the edges as he struggled to catch his breath. "Bailey," he gasped, reaching out a trembling hand. "Help!" Bailey was at his side in an instant, barking frantically. She licked his face, whining with distress, then suddenly turned and sprinted down the trail toward the road, her barks echoing through the trees as she ran for help. Moose approached more cautiously, making soft, distressed sounds. He pressed his large body close to Henry's side, forming a warm barrier against the cooling evening air. The young bear gently nudged his head against Henry's chest, then began licking Henry's hand with surprising tenderness, his dark eyes filled with what could only be described as concern. "Good boy," Henry whispered, fighting to stay conscious. "Stay with me." Time seemed to stretch and compress all at once. Henry drifted in and out of awareness, the pain in his chest ebbing and flowing like a tide. Moose remained steadfastly by his side, occasionally making soft sounds as if to check that Henry was still awake, his warm breath a comfort against the chill that had settled into Henry's bones. In the distance, Henry heard Bailey's continued barking, growing louder again as she returned. With her came voices, human voices calling his name. Help had arrived. "Over here," a woman's voice called. "I see something through the trees." Two hikers, a young couple Henry vaguely recognized from town, emerged into the clearing, led by an exhausted Bailey. They froze momentarily at the sight of Moose pressed against Henry, but Bailey's demeanor, protective but not aggressive, seemed to reassure them. "Mr. Miller," the woman asked tentatively, taking a careful step forward. "Are you okay?" Henry managed a weak nod. "Heart," he gasped. "Medicine, at cabin." The man was already on his phone, calling for an ambulance. "We need emergency services at the North Trail entrance near Snowpine Creek," he reported. "Elderly man down, possible heart attack." The woman knelt beside Henry, keeping a respectful distance from Moose, who watched her warily but made no threatening moves. "The ambulance is coming," she assured Henry. "Just try to stay calm and breathe slowly." Bailey circled anxiously, whining and occasionally nuzzling Henry's face. Moose remained firmly planted against Henry's side, a living windbreak against the cooling evening air. It seemed an eternity before the wail of sirens reached them, and longer still before the paramedics arrived with the stretcher. They approached cautiously, eyeing Moose with understandable concern. "That's Moose," Henry managed to explain between labored breaths. "He won't hurt you, just scared." The paramedics exchanged glances but professionally focused on their patient. As they prepared to move Henry onto the stretcher, Moose reluctantly backed away, responding to Bailey's gentle nudges. "His medications are at his cabin," the female hiker explained to the paramedics. "About half a mile that way. We'll radio ahead and have someone check." One paramedic responded efficiently, hooking Henry up to a portable monitor. "BP's dropping. We need to move now." As they lifted Henry onto the stretcher, Bailey barked sharply, as if giving instructions. She led the way down the trail, looking back frequently to ensure they were following. Moose trailed behind the group, keeping his distance from the strangers but unwilling to be separated from Henry. When they reached the ambulance parked on the narrow forest road, Bailey sat directly in front of the vehicle, refusing to move until they had loaded Henry inside. Only then did she step aside, whining softly as the doors began to close. One of the paramedics paused, looking at the old dog and the bear hovering uncertainly behind her. "What about them?" he asked. "We can't take animals in the ambulance." The female hiker stepped forward. "I'll stay with them and make sure they get back to Mr. Miller's cabin safely. I know where his spare key is hidden." Henry managed to lift a hand in gratitude before the ambulance doors closed completely. The last thing he saw was Bailey sitting upright on the road, Moose's large form behind her, both watching as the ambulance pulled away. The news spread through Snowpine Creek like wildfire. Henry Miller had suffered a heart attack in the woods, and his dog and pet bear had saved his life. By morning, the story had grown, embellished with each telling. By afternoon, the local paper had run a special edition with the headline, "Man's Best Friends, Dog and Bear Team Up to Save Owner." Social media exploded with the story, sharing photos taken by the hikers. Bailey sitting vigilantly in front of the hospital entrance where Henry had been taken, and Moose, who had been safely returned to Henry's property by Carl Jameson and 2 other neighbors, poking his head curiously into the back of Carl's pickup truck as they departed for the hospital, his eyes seemingly filled with concern for his human caretaker. The story captured hearts across Washington state and beyond. Local news stations sent reporters to Snowpine Creek, interviewing townspeople about the unusual family that lived at the edge of the forest. Everyone seemed to have a story about Henry, Bailey, and Moose, the retired vet who had treated their pets for free when times were hard, the friendly golden retriever who greeted everyone on morning walks, and the gentle bear who thought he was a dog. Henry, meanwhile, recovered slowly in the county hospital. His heart attack had been relatively mild, caught early enough to prevent permanent damage, but at his age, recovery would take time. Margaret Wilson visited daily, bringing updates about Bailey and Moose, who were being cared for by a rotation of neighbors. "Bailey barely eats," Margaret reported, concern etching her weathered face. "She just sits by the window watching the driveway, and Moose follows her everywhere, making these sad little sounds." "They miss you something terrible, Henry." Henry nodded, his own eyes misting. "I miss them too. How much longer until I can go home, do you think?" Before Margaret could answer, a nurse entered with Henry's afternoon medications and a thin envelope. "This came for you, Mr. Miller," she said, handing him the envelope. Official looking. Henry thanked her and opened it with trembling fingers. As he read the contents, his face paled. "What is it?" Margaret asked, alarmed by his expression. Henry handed her the letter. "It's from the Washington State Department of Wildlife Conservation. They've denied my permit application for Moose. They say he's grown too large to be considered an ordinary pet, regardless of his behavior. I have 30 days to surrender him to the state wildlife sanctuary, or I'll be in violation of state law." Margaret read through the letter, her lips thinning with anger. "This is ridiculous. After everything that's happened, after he helped save your life." Henry took the letter back, folding it carefully. "They're following protocol, Maggie. A full-grown black bear doesn't belong in a residential area, no matter how well behaved." "But Moose isn't just any bear," Margaret protested. "He was raised by Bailey, he's never known the wild. What will happen to him in a sanctuary?" Henry had asked himself the same question countless times since finding Moose. The truth was, Moose was neither fully wild nor fully domesticated. He had bear instincts, climbing, digging, fishing, but he had learned to suppress his more aggressive tendencies, to be gentle with Bailey and Henry, to trust humans in a way no truly wild bear would. "I don't know," Henry admitted. "But I know he needs Bailey. She's his mother in every way that matters." Margaret's expression softened. "Then we'll fight this, Henry. The whole town will stand behind you." And fight they did. From his hospital bed, Henry coordinated a response that drew on every connection he had made in his long career and life in Snowpine Creek. He asked Carl Jameson to convene a special town council meeting to discuss Moose's situation. He called his old colleague, Dr. Jenkins, who agreed to write a professional assessment of Moose's unique case. Margaret enlisted the help of the town's only lawyer, James Chan, who worked primarily on real estate transactions but offered his services pro bono to draft a formal appeal. The principal of Snowpine Creek Elementary School, where Margaret had taught for 30 years, organized the children to write letters and draw pictures supporting Mr. Henry's bear. The children's artwork proved particularly moving: crayon drawings of a golden dog and a black bear holding paws, of Henry and his unusual family sitting on a porch watching the sunset, of Moose with tears in his eyes as he waited by a hospital bed. These images were pinned to bulletin boards throughout the school and in the town, silent testimony to the impact Henry, Bailey, and Moose had made on the community. Dr. Jenkins's assessment was thorough and scientifically sound. The black bear known as Moose has undergone a unique developmental process, she wrote, having imprinted on a domestic dog during his critical early development. He has formed neural pathways and behavioral patterns that are atypical for his species. Moose now perceives the dog, Bailey, as his mother and has formed an inseparable emotional bond. If separated from the surrogate parent and placed in a standard wildlife sanctuary setting, Moose would likely experience significant psychological distress, potentially leading to depression, self-harm, or failure to thrive. She concluded with a powerful statement: "In my professional opinion, as a wildlife veterinarian with over 30 years of experience, forcing Moose to adapt to life among other bears would cause irreparable emotional harm to an animal that has already endured the trauma of early maternal separation. Furthermore, Moose lacks the natural wariness of humans that would be necessary for any future release into the wild, making him permanently dependent on human care." The appeal gained momentum as Henry's release from the hospital approached. A local reporter from the Seattle Times made the journey to Snowpine Creek, spending a day at Henry's cabin with Margaret and the neighbors who were caring for Bailey and Moose in Henry's absence. The resulting article, complete with photographs of Moose resting his head on Bailey's back while the old dog gazed forlornly out the window, struck a chord with readers across the state. The online version went viral, spawning the hashtag #LetMooseStay that began trending on social media platforms. Letters and emails flooded the offices of the Department of Wildlife Conservation. The children's drawings were compiled into a booklet and formally presented to the department by Principal Whitaker herself. Dr. Jenkins appeared on a local morning news show, explaining the science behind animal imprinting and advocating for a compassionate approach to Moose's unique case. 2 weeks after the initial rejection letter, Henry was finally cleared to return home. Margaret drove him from the hospital, warning him that a small surprise awaited. "Nothing too exciting, I hope," Henry said, his hand pressed lightly to his chest where a new scar marked the surgeon's work. "Doctor says I need to avoid stress." Margaret just smiled mysteriously as they turned onto the long driveway leading to Henry's cabin. "I think you'll find this surprise quite calming, actually." As they approached, Henry saw that his porch had been rebuilt and expanded, the rickety steps replaced with a gently sloping ramp that would be easier for him to navigate. The yard, which had been partially torn up by Moose's enthusiastic digging before Henry's heart attack, had been neatly landscaped, with specific areas designated for Moose's bear activities and others restored to garden. But the most surprising change lay beyond the yard, where once there had been only dense forest. Henry could now see a large fenced enclosure extending into the trees. It was constructed of natural wood and designed to blend seamlessly with the surrounding forest, but it was unmistakably a bear habitat, complete with climbing structures, a small pond, and winding paths through the trees. "What is this?" Henry asked, his voice catching with emotion. Margaret squeezed his hand. "The town's gift to you, Bailey, and Moose." Everyone pitched in. Carl designed it based on professional bear sanctuaries. The high school woodshop class built the structures. James Chen negotiated with the forestry department for the land use permit. "It's a compromise we hope the wildlife department will accept. A natural environment where Moose can develop his bear skills while still being close to you and Bailey." Tears welled in Henry's eyes as he took in the extent of the community's effort. "I don't know what to say, Maggie. This must have cost a fortune." "Some things are worth every penny," she replied simply. "Now, there are two friends inside who have been waiting very impatiently to see you." As if on cue, the cabin door opened, and Bailey bounded out as fast as her arthritic legs would carry her, barking joyfully. Behind her came Moose, now fully the size of a yearling black bear, moving with surprising grace for his bulk. Henry knelt carefully, mindful of his healing chest, and buried his face in Bailey's golden fur as she whined and licked his face frantically. Moose approached more cautiously, sniffing Henry thoroughly as if checking that he was really the same person, before gently pressing his massive head against Henry's shoulder in a bear version of a hug. "I missed you too, big guy," Henry murmured, scratching behind Moose's ears the way he liked. "Both of you." That evening, as the sun set over Snowpine Creek, Henry sat on his newly rebuilt porch with a cup of tea, watching Bailey and Moose explore the edge of their new, expanded territory. Bailey moved slowly these days, but Moose always adjusted his pace to match hers, never straying far from his canine mother's side. Margaret had left a folder of paperwork on the kitchen table, the revised appeal to the wildlife department, incorporating the new habitat as a compromised solution. Henry would read through it tomorrow, but tonight he simply wanted to be present with his unusual family, grateful for each moment they had together. As darkness fell, Bailey and Moose returned to the porch. Bailey settled at Henry's feet with a contented sigh, while Moose, still surprisingly gentle despite his growing size, lowered himself carefully to the porch floor, resting his head on Bailey's back in their familiar sleeping position. Henry reached down to place one hand on Bailey's head and the other on Moose's broad back, feeling the steady rhythm of their breathing. "You're the gift Mother Bailey brought so that I could have a home one more time," he said softly, echoing words he had spoken during their first winter together. Outside, the first stars appeared in the clear spring sky. Inside the cabin, the lamps cast a warm yellow glow through the windows, spilling out onto the porch where man, dog, and bear sat together in peaceful communion. In the distance, an owl called, and somewhere deeper in the forest, perhaps another bear roamed, a reminder of the wild heart that beat within Moose, tempered by the love that had shaped him. 3 weeks later, a final letter arrived from the Department of Wildlife Conservation. Henry opened it with trembling fingers, Bailey and Moose watching curiously from their spots by the fireplace. The letter was brief but clear. After reviewing all evidence, including Dr. Jenkins's assessment, the community petition, and documentation of the new habitat constructed on Henry's property, the department has decided to grant a special exemption. Moose will be allowed to remain in Snowpine Creek under Henry and Bailey's guardianship as a semi-wild family, a designation created specifically for this unique case. There were conditions, of course: regular veterinary checkups, continued habitat improvements, educational opportunities for local schools to learn about bear conservation, but the core request had been granted. Their family would stay together. Henry read the letter aloud, his voice breaking with emotion. Bailey thumped her tail against the floor, while Moose, sensing the happiness in Henry's tone, made a soft huffing sound of contentment. That first spring evening, after the good news arrived, Henry made a pot of his favorite tea and carried it out to the porch. Bailey followed, her steps slower now, but her eyes still bright with intelligence and love. Moose trailed behind, now a strong, healthy young bear whose gentle nature continued to defy expectations. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Henry settled into his rocking chair. Bailey rested her head on his lap, her white muzzle contrasting with his dark pants. Moose, now far too large to join them on the small porch, sprawled contentedly on the grass below, his massive head tilted up toward them as if following their conversation. Henry stroked Bailey's soft head, feeling the slight tremble that had developed in her aging body. "We did it, old girl," he murmured. "We're home. All of us. Together." Bailey sighed deeply, her brown eyes meeting his with the understanding that had always passed between them. Beyond the porch, Moose huffed softly and rolled onto his back, exposing his belly to the last warm rays of the setting sun, a gesture of complete trust and contentment. As darkness settled over Snowpine Creek, warm yellow light spilled from the little cabin windows. Inside and out, the unusual family that had captured hearts across the state prepared for another night together, bound not by blood but by something perhaps even stronger, a cross-species family forged in rescue, nurtured through adversity, and sealed by love that transcended the natural order to create something rare and precious in the shadow of the Cascade Mountains.